this came down like really recently, is that Zelensky's ready to join the Trump-Putin talks after Frank White House meeting. So the meeting earlier in the week when Zelensky arrived had discussions at the White House. There was stuff initially suggesting that, he kept pushing for Tomahawks, saying he's going to give the US drones and train the US how to use drones as long as he gave them Tomahawks. Well, for a start, that sounds like someone's reaching and is actually hurting for material. It's not a position of a strong negotiation, really. There was also a bit more stuff. Now, outside of this, and we will look at what Trump had said as well, it seemed the rhetoric of the last couple of weeks of, we might give them Tomahawks, or we might do this, or we might do that, or that Ukraine is going to curb stomp Russia and get everything back and everything else. That narrative has shifted. And the question was where Trump was getting that information from, or who he was listening to. Now, obviously, there's plenty of people out there who believe that. But the question is, what evidence was Trump looking at to support that claim? If he had evidence, then ultimately that would come to light. So, in due course, either significant military capability added to Ukraine, or mass numbers of bodies, or something would change on the battlefield. It's not the sort of thing you're going to hold in reserve of Ukraine thinking it can push Russia out completely. They're not going to sit on that. They're going to use it. So whatever Trump was looking at to make those statements, or whatever he's basing those statements off, if that information was not public, it would become public in due course. Maybe not from the US, but we'd see the change on the battlefield, or we'd see change in the conflict in some way, and we could then trace that back and go, okay, well, that's what Trump was referring to when he made those statements. The concern, though, was that anybody who was not so much slightly critical, who really looked closely at what was going on and wasn't a blind advocate for either side, was scratching their head about what Trump was referring to. Now, the Flamingo medium-range/long-range cruise missile that Ukraine is building might have the capability to deliver on some of that stuff, but the problem is their production pipeline is very constrained. They can't build enough of them. They're unable to field enough of them on the battlefield or from launch sites to have to be the hinge factor that they want it to be. And the same probably would come down with the Tomahawks as well. If they were to be fielded in sufficient numbers to have the effect that Ukraine wants, as Trump points out, he'd have none left. And US needs them. So he's not going to give them all to Ukraine. And Russia also rightly points out that they have countermeasures that they're not using, but they will use. And they will take actions to mitigate the effect of these arriving in theatre, which is fair and true based on what people know about the makeup of military forces, Russian military forces. The effectiveness, no? Well, but then again, no one really knows because it's not come up against it. You go back to those articles that we looked at a couple of weeks ago or last week where people were talking about the the arms manufacturing within Russia and the fact that they're actually a net exporter of armaments at the moment. So they've been in a war for the last 3 years, one that we've been told constantly that Russia is on the edge of collapse, that they've run out of hardware, they've run out of people, they've run out of money and everything else. That is contrary to the article saying, well, Russia's arms industry is exporting actively to various nations. They've ramped up particularly drone capacity, manufacturing capacity stuff. Okay, so yeah, coming out of the meeting earlier in the week, there's a lot of stuff about TLAMs and everything else. It didn't seem, at least not in the reporting I saw, it didn't seem that there was a lot of confrontationalism in the meeting Zelensky had when he was at the White House. It seemed to be relatively straightforward. No one was telling him, thou shalt give up everything. It just seemed to be a continuation of it. I mean, if anything, it was Zelensky trying to push for more money, more weapons and TLAMs and stuff. I mean, some people are getting a bit sick of his constant grifting, but it makes sense that he'd be there asking for that sort of stuff. Putin calling Trump, and apparently it was that way around. Some people are saying it's because of the threat of TLAMs. Maybe. There is also a suggestion out there that it was Putin basically ringing up Trump and saying, look, here's the way the world works. You sell those or you give those to Ukraine and they use them. This is what we're going to use in response. And Trump going, backing down. Because the tone on him willing to give TLAMs to Ukraine or used in the conflict changed after his conversation with Putin. So I'm guessing Putin either pulled back the curtain a little bit and said, you see this stuff? We're going to use it. And Trump was like, okay, bluff has been called. Or there was some other aspect to that call. Now, it may have been also Putin's just gone, okay, we're going to accept this and that, this and that. We'll jump to, again, the meat of what Trump had to say about it. But the idea that now Zelensky, if it's an invitation in a format where we meet as three, or as it's called, a shuttle diplomacy, we will agree. So this then raises the question. You've got to look at what's not being said or why it's happening. Previously, all right, so wind the clock all the way back to 2022. There were peace talks planned for or scheduled in Istanbul early 2022, and most people, in hindsight, believe that that was the best chance for peace. It is also believed that the emergency diplomacy from Boris Johnson, former British Prime Minister, was what convinced Zelensky not to agree to peace at that time. And then subsequently the SBU took out one of their own negotiators, blah, 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 blah. Well, actually, that killing of the negotiator, extrajudicial killing by the SBU of one of their own negotiators, I think was more of a message to Putin that peace wasn't going to happen, irrespective of what was put on the table. All right, so we now move forward, people not really wanting to sit down and talk. Putin, in his sit-downs with Trump in Alaska, and also what he said openly about, look, this is what we want to achieve or anything, fundamentally has the upper hand. I don't care what people think or claim otherwise. He fundamentally has the upper hand. Possession, 9/10 of the law. Crimea is going to stay Russian. The occupied zones of Luhansk and Donetsk are going to stay Russian. If you look at how the battlefields have evolved and what they've then done in the occupied zones, there is, short of all of NATO taking to the battlefield, and even then, it's not a guarantee, the Russians aren't being dislodged. The Russians also held elections in those occupied regions, and they all voted to switch to Russia. Okay, now it can be disputed how free those elections were. Certainly as free as the ones in Moldova, and everyone celebrated those because they went the way of the EU. Certainly as free as the ones in Romania, that they then redid 3 times until they got the result the EU wanted. So there's no clean hands in any of this. But the elections were held, and they were as legitimate as the outcome from Euromade. And ultimately, if we go back to 2014, I mean, you can go back to 1991 if you really want to, but if the outcome of Euromade, let's just speculate here, obviously it went EU away from Russia, fair enough, not a problem. Politics swings back and forth. But had there been more of a conciliatory approach at that time from Kiev and the western oblasts to Luhansk, Donetsk, and even what's the southern city they haven't taken yet? Odessa. That we probably wouldn't have seen conflict had they accepted that there are regions of Ukraine that are not in favour of the EU, that have very strong cultural and historical ties to Russia. Then maybe there wouldn't have been the conflict initially, that people would have negotiated a settlement of, okay, look, you guys don't have to agree with how the Euromaidens turned out. Euromaidan just seemed to be focused on, well, whatever people want in Kiev is good for the whole country, or from those Western Oblasts is good for the whole country. When the idea of Ukraine as this single amorphous blob doesn't ring true. It's like the people who looked at Iraq and Afghanistan as single nations, when ultimately they're held together, multiple different tribes and things like this. And once you take the government away, warlords emerge, and you have all these other problems of tribal conflict and sectarian violence and all the other bits and pieces. It's part of the reason Yugoslavia fell apart, and Croatia and everyone else suddenly emerged, and Bosnia and Kosovo and all those other places. I mean, Yugoslavia were these disparate peoples being held together in a single nation of sorts up to that point. Ukraine has a similar sort of thing. I mean, even the Western Oblast is territory taken from Poland. And no one's rushing to tell Ukraine to give it back to the Poles. So the idea that these Eastern Oblasts and Crimea were going to always go along with a heavily EU swing from Kiev, no. But at the same time, I don't recall there being much of a conciliatory approach. It was a case of, we in Kiev have decided we're doing this, it's going to go this way. And you saw riots in Odessa. You saw deaths out of the trade unions building. You saw problems coming out of, obviously, Donetsk and Luhansk turned into conflict. They went, nope, we're not going to buy in. You guys achieved it at the point of a gun. We're going to achieve it at the point of a gun. And then over time, because they couldn't find a peaceful outcome, and in essence, Ukraine looked like the rest of Ukraine was trying to curb stomp Luhansk and Donetsk, blah, 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 blah. Days go by. Russia eventually goes, you can't attempt to genocide, ethnically cleanse ethnic Russian people like that. And then eventually Putin goes, right, that's it, we're coming in to fix it. Okay, long story short, that's where we are. And so, up until now, particularly post-February 2022, all you've heard from Zelensky is chest beating. He's strutting around like a pigeon playing chess. And the problem being is that a lot of the rest of Europe never liked Ukraine to begin with. It was always seen as corrupt, people trafficking problems, very, very, very problematic. But it was one of those things that people willingly forgot. And the same thing too, Russia was normalising relations with a lot of Europe up to that point. which is also why I think the MH17 outcome I don't think is completely accurate either, because how it's played into certain things. Yeah, I do think Russia has the TEL that launched the missile. Who launched the missile, though, I think is still factually murky, because both sides have heavily invested to only share the facts that support their point of view. All right. Okay, I didn't hear the media report saying that it was going to be a shouting match, and it certainly didn't look like there was issues coming out of it. But, yep, there's still large areas of disagreement, quite clearly. Zelensky was guarded. He said the meeting was frank. Well, okay, well, maybe that means there was the Trump being sold. He told Trump that his main aim was a just peace, not a quick peace. Well, he criticised Hungary as the location. Now, look, if you want both parties there, if you want Putin there, and you're going to pick a place in Europe, Hungary and Serbia are about it. Unless you're going to go into Belarus, you're pretty much stuck. And given the yelling and screaming that various politicians are saying, there's no guarantee that Putin has got safe passage or will leave again. So the idea that Hungary, okay, they're part of the EU. Zelensky might cry about it because they're aligned with Russia, but as a neutral site or a near neutral site, you can't get much better, to be honest. Saying that Hungary could not do anything positive for Ukrainians or even provide a balanced contribution. So just because Orban doesn't want to be heavily involved in the Ukraine-Russian conflict, well, okay, yeah, Zelensky's going to tell him say that it's not appropriate. I think Zelensky's going to be finding out very quickly what people actually think. Trump wants to make it comfortable for everybody. It would be, yes, leaders, they will have to get together at some point. Lavrov, now I said this previously as well, this guy is the one to keep an eye out for when Putin eventually steps down or is no longer in power. I don't know that he's being groomed for the job, but he certainly seems to be in position for it. Yep, they had a constructive phone call on preparations. Yeah, Zelensky had one of the Tomahawks, but yeah, walked away empty-handed. I think that was based on the Putin-Trump call. Which means Zelensky probably came in under the misconception he was getting TLAMs, which I don't know how he got that idea. I mean, Trump was talking about things, but yeah, I think a lot of people are like, yeah, that's not happening. That's not happening. Now, you can believe the media if you want, but people with their heads screwed on were like, yep, nope, unlikely to go ahead. Trump had warned Zelensky that Putin would destroy Ukraine if he didn't agree to its terms. I don't know about that. Again, Russia doesn't have the interest, doesn't want Kiev. US side was said to have echoed Russian talking points at the volatile meeting. No. It reported that Trump tossed aside maps of the front line of Ukraine and insisted Zelensky surrender the entire eastern Donbass to Putin. Now, this comes into this other article, which we're going to look at, which is Trump wrote in social media shortly after the meeting that Russia and Ukraine should stop where they are, referring to the current vast front line. Let both claim victory, let history decide. Yeah, I think Russia's going to come out of it better. As much as it pains people to hear that. I mean, it's like you look at Cyprus and how Turkey's looked at for having invaded and everything else. Zelensky reacted by saying he's ready for an immediate ceasefire, insisted Ukraine will not gift anything to the aggressor. Again, depends on how you define aggressor. Putin's spokesperson said that Russia's position was unchanged without giving any further details. Now, Russia's claim is we'll take the terrain currently held, and that's it. I mean, and that Ukraine doesn't join NATO or the EU, or, well, doesn't join NATO, and NATO stops its arming of them, etc. And that also Russia doesn't want neutral troops there to observe. No, that's it. It's going to be where they are, and basically that's it, which is fair enough. So yeah, I don't know that they want. Well, I mean, I think they wouldn't mind the entire Donbass, but yeah. Kiev, Venezuela saying the demands are tantamount to a de facto capitulation. Guess what? Because it is. Well, not quite. Blah, blah, blah. 20% blah doesn't. Okay. Trump. Yeah, I don't think Trump is fully and completely on Putin's side. He's not. Trump is on Trump's side. He wants to see a peace. And I think, and I've thought this for a while, I think he sees the balance of power where it is, and that concessions have to be made. Now, I don't know where he was getting the whole Ukraine can throw Russia out completely, because this appears to be like a 180 in his previous statements. And it's like, well, what's happened? Well, what's happened in between is a phone call from Putin and the fact that someone is now actually applying pressure to Zelensky, because it seems like no one's applied pressure to him in any way, shape or form. Everyone's quite happily given him money and arms and everything else. SBU, yeah, right. And see, the SBU is interesting. So if Zelensky ever was removed from power, I'd be more concerned about the SBU, what they may do, and also that they'd probably step in to control the power vacuum somehow. Yeah, I don't know how much of a free and fair elections we're going to see again in Ukraine in the near future. So yeah, not Disneyland, not kindergarten, major shift in positions, yep. So yeah, he said that back then it could win all of Ukraine in its original form after getting to know and fully understand the positions and the economic situation. However, it's changed. Even on Monday, Trump said Ukraine could still win it. However, I don't think they will. And that, yep, Ukraine will likely have to give up some territory. Zelensky is constantly rejected. Well, Zelensky can say what he wants, but it's not going to change the reality of what's on the ground. The attempt to continue to pressure Russia, but again, Russia's arms industry and stuff, yeah, I also think it's that part of the fact like Brazil and India and China continue to buy Russian oil. The attempt to sanction Russia into compliance, well, I don't think Russia was exporting that much to those nations sanctioning them. Well, maybe gas to Europe, but they found other buyers. So the net overall effect is more of damage to the nations doing the sanctions, because they've cut off a big part of their hydrocarbon supply. They've cut off their winter heating supplies. And now they've got to find other sources that aren't as readily available or aren't as easy to acquire. And so there's this idea that the sanctions have actually bitten the nations imposing them more than it has Russia, because the nature of the Russian economy isn't the same as Western economies. So, yeah. So we will look at two more articles before we finish up. This one, though, is the article about where Trump came out 2 days ago, a day and a bit ago. Yep. Go away. That the Donbass region of Ukraine should be cut up, leaving most of it in Russian hands to end a war that has dragged on for nearly 4 years. A couple of months away. Let it be cut the way it is, he told reporters. It's cut up right now, adding, you can leave it the way it is right now. They can negotiate something later on down the line, he said, but for now, both sides of the conflict should stop at the battle line. Go home, stop fighting, stop killing people. Fair enough. I mean, that makes reasonably good sense. And I think that, that's what I felt the eventual ceasefire / peace line is going to be. The latest comments come after Ukrainian drones struck a major gas processing plant in southern Russia, forcing it to suspend its intake of gas from Kazakhstan, Russian and Kazakh authorities said. He's edged back in the direction of pressing Ukraine to give up and retaking land it's lost to Russia. I got a feeling Russia's pointed out some of its air defense systems that it's going to start ramping up. That's my spin on things. Whether Russian President Vladimir Putin would be opening the war without taking significant property from Ukraine, Trump responded, well, he's going to take something. Yep, okay, so again, the front lines haven't really shifted. It says Ukrainian counteroffensive. I think this... Yeah, ISW. Okay. ISW have been little more than propagandists, really, to be honest. Their stuff looks good, but they keep spewing the same sort of stuff time and time again when the reaction on the ground doesn't seem to match up. So the idea that this was always going to be Russian-held territory, down here, okay, I could see, yep, that was a actual counteroffensive. In and around Kharkiv, maybe. But Sumy and into Kiev, etc., I don't think Russia ever had the interest. It was a feint to consolidate this area and also to pressure Putin to the negotiating table. They were always planned to withdraw and hold these regions. Partisan warfare, well, again, that depends on how you define it. I think that boundary is pretty right. I mean, it's along the river, mainly. It also means that Russia has the... I'm pretty sure it's down here. The nuclear power plant that's down here as well. Plus they've got all the steel works and coal mines and everything else. Trump says, we're the only nation that goes in, wins a war, then leaves. No, you're not. You didn't win Vietnam. You left. Somalia wasn't a win, to be honest. Iraq, you could argue, wasn't necessarily a win. But there were troops on the ground there for a lot longer than, well, a lot of people wanted. Afghanistan, I don't think many people are regarding that as a win. Europe, well, there's still US boots on ground and bases in Europe. I don't know of too many places where you could make that claim legitimately that the US has won a war and left completely. I mean, even if you look at Afghanistan, Trump's talking about getting Bagram Air Base back. I mean, most of the combat troops will be removed, but there's still going to be military bases. So the meetings, they're saying that the meetings with Zelensky were tense. Yeah, Trump doesn't look too happy in that photo, and Zelensky, that looks like a forced expression as well. Saying that he pushed Zelensky to give up swaths of territory. Okay, so it lines up with the other article. Did not commit to providing with TLAMs. And, well, what security guarantees are going to be? That's going to be it. Okay, well, it sounds like yet more negative feedback. Your country will freeze and your country will be destroyed if Ukraine doesn't make a deal with Russia. Yeah, well, Russia's successfully hitting power distribution networks. They're not supplying gas anymore. In fact, I think they were actually, early on in the conflict, still supplying gas to Ukraine. But, well, they got every right to turn the taps off, thanks to the Polish judge. It's not a case of targeting the civilian population of Ukraine. It just so happens that they're going to suffer as a result of the infrastructure being targeted. Zelensky continues his line of he won't voluntarily cede any territory. Okay, they're holding back comments. It's tough negotiations, yes, and it's another shift in position by the war, and that he thinks originally Ukraine's going to win. Now, the Russian leader proposed a territorial swap in which Ukraine would cede the regions Donetsk and Luhansk in return for small parts of, I can't pronounce that one, and Kherson. One of the sources said US officials proposed exactly that swap to Zelensky in the meeting the following day. Ukrainians see a major strategic value in the portion of Donbass that they hold. They believe giving up the territory would make the rest of Ukraine much more vulnerable to Russian offensives. Well, okay, now, the comments. It was further down. Now that everyone's woken up, they're putting different articles in because there are different answers. There was an article. Yeah, okay, so there's people here saying, look, that the 2014 was a coup d'etat. In essence, it wasn't really a coup, it wasn't military. But yeah, that there was a lot of Western influence. I think that's the safest thing to say. In the Euromaidan protests and everything else. Then the immediate suppression of Russian heritage and lack of Russian language and everything else basically came across as something made by Western Ukrainians who either didn't care or no longer wished to acknowledge the close ties that Eastern Ukrainians had. And they felt, presumably, that they had the moral authority to do so when, well, whole chunks of the country were like, well, no, we don't agree with it. And so it's been antagonistic ever since. Well, some people think it's Ukraine. Okay, yeah, these are people who don't like Trump. There was a comment down here. Get it done already, Trump. You won the popular vote, swing states, and the presidency on the promise of, well, not just that promise. He won, I think, his re-election based on economic grounds. Europe's goal for Ukraine are unachievable, unclear, and utopian. Yep, that's a fair comment. If the despicable regime creature Boris Johnson hadn't blown up the initial talks between Russia and Ukraine, this all could have been over. I think that's a fair statement as well. Everyone's an idiot.